Chapter 7, Drivers for Growth, Technology, Policy, and Institutions. Super interesting chapter. In this, we're going to learn how we get to sustained growth. In the Solo model, which we saw in the last video, we know this equation, YT star, which is output per worker and at equilibrium price, not equilibrium price, output per worker at an equilibrium point is equal to A times KT star raised to 0.3. We went through this in detail in the last video, 30 minutes. Check it out. So now we're going to build on top of this Solo model. Why are we going to be building on top of this Solo model? Because if you see this variable A, which is productivity, it is exogenous, meaning it's given and it's fixed. You see, there is no subscript that says, hey, A changes. Whereas in the Rover model, which is what we're going to learn now, we will see how A changes with time. We'll get to a lot of this detail, but the key distinction between the Solo model, which does not provide how we can get sustained growth, versus the Rover model, it gives you a glimpse as to how sustained growth is possible through changing A, which is productivity, through technology. So now let's get into how do we get to this equation, the Rover model equation, which is what this entire chapter is based on. The Rover model basically is assuming that technology, productivity A is endogenous, whereas the Solo model assumed technology A as a given, so it doesn't change. So endogenous growth theory, which is the Rover model, same names, endogenous growth theory, Rover model, exogenous growth theory, Solo model. The way you get to that is that you assume that you have certain percentage of people working on technology. And why does technology matter? Because technology has two characteristics. Technology is non-rivalrous and technology is non-excludable. So let's dissect those words a little, right? So Solo model says, hey, A is exogenous. Rover model, A is endogenous, meaning my model should change based on technology changes. And it's betting on technology. And the reason is for these two reasons that it's betting on technology. Technology is non-rivalrous. Think about this for a moment. In this model, KT is basically the ratio of capital K divided by labor L. KT here is K by L. What this means is that when your capital increases, your capital to labor ratio increases, right? So capital and labor, they are rivalrous. You have to increase capital and labor at the same time to keep the capital labor ratio same. If your capital goes down and your labor increases, then KL is, it's conflicting each other. So that's why capital and labor are rivalrous, whereas technology is not rivalrous. An intuitive way to think about this is, think about technology as scalable. You can have machines run non-stop. You can have machines run without any limits, right? Whereas there is limits to how much capital you have, how much labor you have, right? So, and it doesn't impact each other. Like technology can coexist with the capital and labor, right? So it doesn't rival like the objects of capital and labor does, right? Technology is different. That's what I'm writing here, right? It's not, technology is a set of ideas, set of designs, set of new ways of doing things, right? So they don't compete with each other in terms of like, hey, if my capital goes up but my labor remains same, then my capital labor ratio increases, right? So the equilibrium point, I'm far off from the equilibrium point, remember from the previous videos. So there's competition. The equilibrium is off, so then it tries to decrease. and get to the equilibrium point, right? But here technology doesn't compete that way with capital and labor, don't compete with each other. So technology is non-rivalrous. It is scalable. You can, without limits, use technology and not have to worry about your ratios impacting. Second, technology is non-excludable. There's non-excludability in technology. What this also means is that, let's say Google comes up with a new software, an open source software, especially an open source software, then anyone else can copy it easily, right? So you cannot say, hey, this technology will only remain in this country. You don't have exclusivity there. You don't have exclusive rights. You have, anyone can adopt it, anyone can build a phone, anyone can re-engineer and build it. These two characteristics of easy to copy and adapt, right? Anyone can use those technologies. Easy, and it's not rivalrous. That makes technology an important aspect of the Roman model. It's betting on technology to be the source of high sustained growth. Increase in sustained growth, right? It's not growth that is steady. They want growth to continuously increase, right? Growth from going from 2% to 2.5%, 3%, steadily growing, right? Whereas the growth of 2% and steady is like flat, which is what the Solow model says, because it considers technology and productivity A as a given, right? So now we know in detail Solow. Now we're going to arrive at this equation, the Romer model. We've just covered a little bit of AT. So let's go to how do we build a Romer model, right? So the first step is we have to assume that technology advances causes sustained economic growth, right? Which we covered through these two. Technology is non-rivalrous. It can augment labor, augment capital, and it is non-excludable, easily copyable, right? So that assumption, now let's say you know that technology is good. So now what do? You put your people. You put a fraction of your people, n bar, which we saw earlier. If n bar is your total population, you take a fraction of those, alpha, let's say 10%, so alpha will be like 0.1. You take a fraction of those, and then you get LA, which is the labor associated with improving A, which is technology or productivity. So you get an R&D population. In your overall population, now if you take some portion of them and make them work on improving technology, that is LA, which is an alpha of n bar. Alpha is a proportion of the total population, is LA. And LA plus LP equals n bar, right? Labor associated with improving technology, LA. Labor associated with improving and producing goods and services, LP. Total is n bar, right? So then what do? The first step is you assume that, hey, technology is going to be helpful. It's actually very powerful, and we know why. Intellectually, it makes sense. Now you take a portion of your population and then make them work on R&D. That's LA. Then that person, that set of people working, will get us this function, production function for growth in technology. Those people, LA, will cause the growth in technology. They'll produce something, they'll invent something, right? So the way you get that is growth in technology, because you put in these people, is equal to gamma alpha NA, right? Which is basically saying, hey, these people, how productive are they? They're productive by gamma factor, right? Alpha NA, total people from the population, times gamma, which basically saying how productive are these people. And let's say each of those people are 20% productive. So this gamma would be like 0.2. And then let's say you only have 10% of the people, so alpha will be 0.1. And then let's say you 100 people, so 100 times 0.1 times 0.2. So then you get growth in technology, right? So it's delta A upon A, or GA equals this. And we just derived this based on this, right? So now build the production function for output per worker or per capita, right? This is output per worker. We know output per worker in Solow looks like this. So you're going to use this to build this. The only difference is we will now assume that only 1 minus alpha people are working on technology, right? So it's the same equation. It's the same equation, except we see that A has a subscript of T. What that means is that my technology now changes with time, right? And that my capital to labor ratio, capital is based on my total number of people working on the product versus the labor, which is based on the time, right? So KP, so the big change is this one, right? And the way to think about 1 minus alpha is, think about this. If I didn't write this and if I just had alpha times, AT KP raised, then that is just technology contribution, right? 1 minus alpha is basically saying, hey, I've taken some of those people out just for production of technology, so I'm going to remove them. So minus times this whole field, right? So this is basically nothing but AT KP raised to 0.3 minus alpha AT KP raised to 0.3. It's basically saying my total output would be the output that I get from producing these laborers that are working on producing goods based on the capital minus the technology, right? Because they're just focused on technology. Technology as is not as useful, right? Like technology enables better output, but technology as is just takes resources. Your R&D organization doesn't sell goods, it builds goods that are sold. So you have to reduce that R&D contribution because they're not directly producing goods. They are building technology that produces goods, right? So that's how you get to the Romer equation. The key distinction is to remember this AT, productivity changes with time, which is the endogenous function, and then we are just having this factor 1 minus alpha to say, hey, I have a certain population that's actually working on the production line, but there's a certain population working on technology, so I'm going to remove those. So then you get the Romer equation, right? So we've built from the Solow equation that we've seen in the past 6-7 videos, and now we built the Romer equation, which tells us that growth, sustained growth, improvement, right? Not steady growth. This is steady growth. Sustained growth, improvement happens with technology, right? So now we've built the Romer equation. Now let's look at the Romer equation and find out how does this equation really change? What are the factors, right? If we see, these are all the factors, right? And in a sense, alpha changes, AT changes, KP changes. Or even better, let's just look at this simple function, right? Growth in technology is based on gamma, productivity, alpha, number of people, and total population. So now let's look at it. If we didn't change anything, then growth would look like this, right? The balanced growth. It's a line with a slope. And look at this, right? The growth is constantly increasing. The output per worker, the per capita income, is balanced growth is 1.43 GA, right? We have GA. We've seen in the previous video how we got the 43% lift, right? Because of technology. So 1.43 GA is a straight line with a slope. So that is basically the balanced growth, right? It's still growing. It's growing. The growth is growing, right? It's not a steady like 2%, right? It's growing. Then now what happens if you change the allocation, alpha? If you change the number of people, alpha, meaning you say, hey, I'm gonna, instead of 20 people from 100 people that I have in my country, I'm gonna now get 40 people to be on R&D. So now if you increase R&D allocation, right, what happens is this curve. We'll get to this one later, but this curve. Basically, what happens here is that when you increase your R&D allocation, the laborers actually go down, right? So let's look at this one. So yeah, so when we increase alpha, right? When we increase alpha, what happens is that our K by L, so L goes up, right? So K by L would go up, right? So the total laborers went down, right? So the laborers associated with my technology would go up, but my total laborers went down. So my K by L function goes up. And so then what happens is I see a slightly lower growth, and then I see an acceleration in growth that is steady, balanced. So you see a curve, because what happens is it tries to go from lower K by L to the steady K star, right? So that's what happens when you allocate more people. And now when you have more people in the population overall, like what happens if your N bar changes? And now what happens then is that your K by L overall is higher. So then what happens is then so when the laborers go up, right, K by L, when the laborers go up, your K by L ratio is down, right? So then it tries to accelerate the growth. And so the initial growth is higher, but then it steady states, right? So that's a three different things, right? Like what happens when you have steady state growth with fixed R&D allocation, it grows. Increase R&D allocation, then there's a takeoff, right? There's an initial slow, because then it tries to get to K star. Remember from the previous video, there's K star is the equilibrium growth, less than K star, higher than K star. Less than K star will accelerate, higher than K star will decelerate, right? So deceleration for us would be like when you have an R&D growth allocation, new allocation, more population, it accelerates, right? And then the fourth thing is change in savings. It's not in this equation. Savings is not in this equation. There are only three factors really. Population, R&D allocation, and overall productivity. We didn't discuss overall productivity, so let's get to that. If overall productivity changes, then the slope just simply changes. Meaning, if let's say technology people have been working on this idea for a couple of years and then they have a breakthrough, right? So then the slope of growth just changed instantly, right? Because they just built something, so the growth just increases. So there are various ways of looking at it. And then there's savings, right? Savings, it was debated multiple times whether savings actually leads to higher growth. The one point that I really liked was higher savings leads to higher investment in technology enablers, which is more technology is built and used. And so the growth could be there, but I think the chapter concluded with saying, hey, savings doesn't really lead to high growth. It's not even in this equation. It is part of the K, right? So it is here. So savings, increase in savings is the K, capital K of the small kp. Increase in savings does increase the overall growth, but it's not like increasing the growth percentages, right? It just steady growth remains that way. So increase in savings, you will see those bumps, right? But not like an acceleration in growth that we see in other equations. I still feel that savings does have like a similar slope increase as well, like I've drawn here. So that was the four different factors on how savings, productivity, savings, percentage people, population changes the overall growth, right? So we've covered both of these. Now we understand the Rover model. We understand like what are the factors that are available for us to look at, right? What factors causes the growth in the Rover model, right? And then we saw how it's different, right, than the Solo model. The Solo model considers technology as exogenous, right? And so it doesn't even have a way to provide for sustained growth. But the Rover model does have it, right, with bet on technology. Right? So now we understand this. Now let's find out, like, hey, like, how do we, so we all assume that, hey, technology is this AT, right? Technology is important. But like, what causes AT to increase, right? So that's why we have to backtrack to find out, like, hey, for us to increase technology, AT, right? So if we have an AT that increases, then all of this works. But like, how do we increase AT? We increase AT through these four factors. AT is nothing but increase in productivity, increase in overall changing your productivity frontier to a higher level of productivity. How do you do that? With technology. So the way you do that in technology is through four things. Investing in education, right? We have the government spending here money with various grants, the National Science Foundation, NIH grants. There's so many grants and loans given for education, free education almost for up until high school in the United States. So that is huge because education increases human capital, the skills, the knowledge. They are now able to work on high technology jobs as part of this equation, alpha, right? So they get wages premium, but then you have to invest. This is the basis. This is what causes technology to be used and invested in, to be built, right? R&D tax cuts, right? So if our R&D goes up, right? This is R&D. AT is nothing but R&D. How do you increase R&D in a company, which is research and development, building new technology? If they get tax incentives, if they get tax cuts, then they will put people to work on innovation, to build new things that are technology enablers, that are non-rivalrous, provide non-exclusivity, right? So this is helpful. R&D tax cuts, institutions, if they are really good at practical R&D, if the government spends money by tax cuts, then that is really helpful. Infrastructural spending, this is debatable, but it's also there. But I can agree, like why infrastructure spending also helps with improving technology. Let's say the government never really built the 50,000 miles road that are existing, interstate highways that are existing today in the United States, then the efficiency of transport, like you have one click, you click on Amazon, you get your products delivered the next day. It's possible because of this high infrastructure spending that was done like before the 1990s, like for the last 50 years before that. And that has helped improve efficiency. And only government can do this, high capital intensive projects. If these infrastructure spending is done, then people will have a situation to actually build for technology, right? Like if you have a country which has dilapidated infrastructure, like the roads are always jam-packed, there's no design of how the roads are built, the infrastructure is so poor that they're constantly worried about like just having hot water at home, then there's hardly any possibility of technology innovation or even education, right? So investments in public health, investments in infrastructure towards better infrastructure is pretty critical for improving technology. Education, R&D, infrastructure, and even government R&D projects that they themselves can do, like nuclear power plants, which were first built by the government because it's so capital intensive. Even the recent COVID-19, a lot of those funding came from the government. Institutions will not see that as profitable in the initial stages, but once they have the technology that they have built, then they can use that. Governments can also help with patents, right? Patents are basically giving you exclusive usage, right? It's giving you the exclusive usage to use that technology, let's say, or that invention for like 20 years, and it is enforceable by law. That means that, hey, if I have a patent that I innovated and built this technology, no one else can use it. But remember, technology has non-excludability as a feature, right? So it's very hard for you to say, hey, I built this phone, no one else should be able to build it. Anyone can reverse engineer it and build it, right? So some aspect, this technology doesn't provide you a moat unless it's designed to provide you a moat, right? So patents is one way, but now, you can use it for 20 years. It's good, but even patents, there's a balance. If you have patents that just stifle innovation because no one else can use that technology, then that's also reducing technology adoption. So there's got to be a right balance on patents, patent law, and all of this, right? All of this really works. Even let's take a simple example of patent. It can only work if you have strong institutions. So that's the third piece, right? We've covered technology, we've covered policy, and now policy, these are all the policies, right? These are all the policies. Government can have policies for higher education, investment education, almost $500 billion spent annually by the state governments and local governments on education, right? So these are all policy decisions. How much tax cuts, how much for R&D investments, how much to invest in projects themselves, infrastructure spending. These are all policy decisions. Then we see how technology is helpful, right? Because technology as a function is going to help power sustained growth. Then for these two to be protected, meaning, hey, now you have built an environment where technology can be thriving. Now you know the technology you're going to use. But then with property rights, that's the final link that actually saves all of this and make sure that all of these obstacles that can come in the way of implementing, let's say, a better technology, human capital in your country. There are these 4 obstacles that we have to be sure of as to how we build right institutions, right? That's the last piece of the chapter, institutions. How we build the right institutions so that, let's say, a simple example like a patent. If you want to protect a patent, you need an effective legal system, an institution that enforces the law, right? Like if someone infringes and uses your property without your permission, then you should have the law enforceable to stop them from abusing your R&D findings, right, without your permission. And it has to be efficient and quick, right? You can't have a backlog system like what currently India faces. It takes years for those court trials to actually finish. So you can't have an inefficient system with lots of backlog, right? And you need to have plenty of lawyers and accessible a low bar way to file for those lawsuits and get quick resolutions. So we need an effective legal system for like protecting the technology, for really powering the long-term growth. Then you need absence of corruption. This is super critical. Like if all of this are not there, forget about all of these investments, forget about long-term growth. And a lot of countries don't have long-term growth because their technology is suffering from these 4 obstacles. Corruption, which is basically saying, hey, if I'm an innovator, I build something new, but if there is someone who is very rich, they can just steal my idea, or they can bribe someone to, take all my good people, or my idea is now theirs without, me having gotten the value. Then that is huge, right? If government starts to steal from me because I have a better idea, then we have a kleptocratic government, which is basically the government stealing from you, which is what happened in Zimbabwe very recently in 2000. The president of Zimbabwe stole literally from the book, and I might be quoting this a little off, so check the book. Is they took the land of the farmers, and that caused output productivity to go down, the tax dollars went down. We covered this in the last video too. So kleptocratic government is another obstacle. Corruption and red tape, like if you have to just if your ideas are stolen because someone else bribed a higher lawyer to in the legal system, and then now they're dragging me in courts for years versus I should be like focusing on building my new innovative product, then the corruption is basically just gonna make all of this not work at all, right? So red tape. And then low cost to establish a legal business. The process should be that there should be a low bar to establishing a legal legitimate business very quickly without like lots of red tape, lots of processes, taking years to just set up something, right? So all of this is very important. Why is this important? Because think about it. If you have a legal system that doesn't work, you will not get investments. People will not be willing to invest because even if they invest, now all of that could be stolen and there's no way to enforce that. So it's very important. These 4 obstacles, if they're not there, the economic growth just completely stalls, right? So now, last point, what I really liked was this World Bank Doing Business report. So the Doing Business report from the World Bank, it's produced now every year, and this has been a huge incentive for governments to now realize that, hey, there's corruption, hey, there's legal processes that are like lots of red tape, hey, there is this government issues that are now being exposed. So this report that now the World Bank has produced tells you a little bit of insight in which you can look up per country. Oh, very insightful. I looked it up for 2020. It was amazing to find out how India has done huge progress, almost at the 60s now. First top 60 countries. It's growing rapidly in terms of their ranking. So World Bank Doing Business Report will help you with this. They'll get you to conviction as to hey, which countries are doing better, which countries are growing, and then figure out like how those countries are actually investing in technology for long-term growth. If not, forget about it, right? You can keep getting foreign aid for those poorer countries, but those poor countries will not have the path to continued success of growth unless those structural changes are changed, right? Like, but these are structural changes, right? Corruption, legal system, property rights at some point, right? How do you get property rights? It's huge. That your land is not going to be just taken away without your permission. It's very important how the legal system is set up. Those are structural changes that are needed, and in initiatives like this report is huge. It provides incentives because government, like Indian government, Narendra Modi recently even quoted this report saying, hey, we are now much better as a country. We're going to be even better for the World Bank Doing Business report. These are incentives that changes structurally instead of like throwing money at the problem. Super insightful. Use technology, build institutions, and use policy to actually thrive in technology.